session of Irish History from the Hedgerow at the Irish Roots Cafe, produced by IrishRoots.com with Peter Riley Adams and Michael O'Laughlin. Find a spot on the warm, sunny side of the hedgerow now. Today's session is about to begin. They were rough, unpolished men, brilliant scholars, teaching by the side of the road, in small rooms, in nooks and crannies, wherever and whenever possible. Such men as these, they were the teachers of the hedge.
A few lines from Kincora, attributed to Mac Lorcain, 1015. O where, Kincora, is Brian the Great, and where is the beauty that once was thine? O where are the princes and nobles that sate at the feast in thy halls and drank the red wine? Where, O Kincora?
It's time for another lesson from the Irish Hedgerow with Michael O'Laughlin and Peter Riley Adams. Today's topic is the Battle of Clontarf and Brian Borus. Are you ready for today's lesson, Mr. Adams?
Absolutely. Brian Borus, one of the most amazing characters in Irish history, whether it be true or not. You know, it's just hard to discern so much thing, but certainly what an amazing character in the history of Ireland.
Well, let's take a look at the world he was born into. We did a previous lesson that talked about the rise of the Vikings in Ireland, and let's take the 10th century, which leads up to Brian's birth and the battle at Clontarf, and you'll see that the Norse defeated the Irish at the beginning there, but then the fortunes were reversed, and the Norse really became another Irish clan or tribe in a lot of ways, and they became converted. These old invaders from the first wave became converted to the Catholic religion, even the Christian religion, and the Dalcassions, Brian's tribe, has just started to take off because in 934, now that's the Dalcassions, which is Brian Borus' family, the ancient tribal name. They really first get mentioned in the year 934 in the Annals of Ireland by the Four Masters. And there were two branches of his family, and of course, the O'Briens descend from that famous line. And you have to remember when you're reading the old works that County Clare was in the province of Munster at that time. And Larkin was Brian's grandfather, and Kennedy was his father. And they think that the best birth date for Brian given is 941, although some records and annals it's given as 926, but we think that was just copied incorrectly. Is that what you found in your research, Peter?
Absolutely, Michael. And one of the things that gives credence to the 940 date is that when we go back to the 1014 date, and imagine that there he was at the battle. Well, if he had been born in 920s, my God, he would have been 90 years old. So it was. Let's be realistic about just things. So there were errors made, and so it's better to say that he was probably only in his 70s when he would still be able to have engaged in such a battle.
That's right. Even though the annals have different numbers, sometimes the Annals of Ulster are better than the Annals of Ireland. You have to think a bit when you're doing it, and that's what a hedge school is supposed to do: teach the students as well as the teachers how to think. And gosh, if you start looking around the time of Brian's birth, you're going to see Cellachan, the king of Munster, was released by the Ui Neill or the Ui Neill up north, and you're going to see battles between the Dalcassions and the Ui Neill. North and south, who really had traditionally ruled the area, and the Vikings start to join in on one side or the other, and they fight just like another Irish clan in alliances. And you've got just a few years after he was born, there was a battle for the Kingship of Tara, and the Vikings or the Norse, they fought on both sides of that battle for that really sacred kingship area of Ireland. And if you've gone to Ireland, you can see it today. Have you ever been to Tara?
I certainly have. And remember, Tara is also important in St. Patrick's story. So you have Patrick, who, of course, and by the year 1000, Patrick was the great legend and the great unifier under Christianity. And so Tara became a very important part. Also, when we talk about the years and, say, for instance, the longevity of Brian Borus's life, in so many other stories, long life is a gift from God and is sometimes a proof of your superiority or your leadership qualities as a person. And so as the true history and as legend grew and things changed, one of the things that Brian had to have, along with being tall and handsome and strong and mighty and having all these wonderful qualities, he had to be old. He had to have long life.
Well, that's right. And, Kennedy, Brian's father, died in 951 when we think he would have been about 10 years old. And when that happened, Brian didn't ascend to the kingship, of course. His brother did, and that would have been Lorcon, I think that's the pronunciation. But he was killed in 953 by his own tribe, by the rival tribe of the Dalcassions. And that brought his brother, Man, up to the kingship, and he did a much better job. And there's a lot of fighting between the Vikings and Mahan as well. Have you run into that?
Yes, absolutely. There was a great deal of rivalry between them. There's also great stories of that because Brian was younger than Mahan, that Brian would always watch and see his brother go off to do a various battle, and his older brother would always look back at him, it said in the legend, and wave at Brian, giving Brian this feeling, because Brian was the younger, and he was taking care of his little brother.
Right, and as you watch all this start to happen, it seems like Dublin is always in alliance with the Vikings and the Leinster, the people from the province of Leinster, and they're always fighting with the province of Munster. There's a big battle going on there, and that's going to play itself out, especially when we come up to the Battle of Clontarf, which is still another 50 or 60 years away. Now, you also see fights between Malmud for the kingship of Munster with Brian's brother. And you finally see his brother, Man, he took control of the stronghold of Cashel. And you see a lot of people in Cashel in Munster. Even to this day, it's one of the few remaining sites that are out there for the kingship.
Cashel, as you drive along the countryside into Tipperary, where it is, but which is also part of Munster, you drive up down in the countryside, and all of a sudden, up in front of you is Cashel. The rock of Cashel is known as today. And traditionally, it's known, yes, as the seat of kings, but it's also, in legend, whether it be true or not, it's said it's where Patrick gave the shamrock as the explanation of the Trinity. So Cashel has this amazing little part of history. It was where Patrick started. It's where the kings set themselves, where Boru set himself eventually, and where the church then took over, because they said they turned it over to the church. And if you go through it, you can get into the little village that's there, nice little village, and then right around it are these small little shops. Then you go up and you walk up the hill, a very steep hill, and you're then into the complex. And there's still a round tower, and there's the remains of the old church part and the great walls. And from that standpoint, you can see for miles on a clear day in Ireland.
Well, that's right. That brings us up to the year 967 when Brian's brother took the ancient and sacred stronghold of Cashel in the province of Munster, which really was quite a feat, and that would play a role in Brian taking over the over kingship of the whole island. And then his brother also took the Viking stronghold of Limerick, which was close to their clan headquarters there in Eastern County Clare, and he expelled the Viking king Ivar in 969. And at that point, Brian's brother also allied himself with the Vikings of Waterford during that time. Now, the Kingship of Ireland was still in strife. You had the northern and southern Ui Neill still battling for who was going to take over. They had established a tradition of, well, you might say a friendly alternation with a few wars in between for who was going to rule Ireland, and it really mattered who had the biggest army and could do the most damage, I think.
You know, as I see you mentioned, the Waterford, and then because with Dublin, and then you think about the battle from Limerick. They're all ports. And so the Vikings, they were controlling the ports because they were controlling the trade. And so when you talk about the person who's over all of Ireland, well, yeah, there were tribal leaders who had Ireland in the fields. And so they were interested in having a lot of cattle and a lot of grain. But anything else that came in, that was where the Normans were, or the Vikings. That's what they were doing. They had control of the ports. And that's where they really were. And then there was the intermarriage. And so that's how some of them got involved. And you say, well, so some of the Norsemen fought with the Irish against other Norsemen and other Irishmen. Well, it was all a matter. It became very economic. But I think it's very important to remember that the Norsemen, the Vikings, were controlling the ports, all of the port cities.
Yeah, that's the wealth of Ireland that they really didn't even have before the Norsemen came in. So the Irish kings wanted to be affiliated with that, and you can be sure they got their cut of the booty that was going around.
And it enabled the Norsemen, because they were also raiding in other places. You know, they were raiding over in Wales and down in France, which eventually became Normandy, where they call of Normandy, their section which they controlled. But they were bringing goods from there to Ireland and goods from Ireland out. There was import and export going on, and the Norsemen were involved in the middle of it. We could say maybe they were some of the first import-export guys in the world.
Oh, that's right. And they had dreams of controlling that Irish Sea on both sides of the coastline and really controlling the wealth by doing that.
You know, crossing the Irish Sea, I've crossed over the Irish Sea by ferry.
Yes.
And because it gets cloudy because of the way the weather is. But to ride across, and I left from Wales, Holyhead, and was going over on the ferry. And at the beginning of it, you can't see much. Then eventually, you start to see the green hills of Ireland spotting up, because we go into Dublin from Holyhead, into the great harbour. But you start to see Ireland. It must have been a great vision. And it takes a couple of hours today in a motorized boat.
Right.
Like a ferry. What it must have been for the Vikings, who were rowers. They didn't use sails, remember. They used the row. And so they're going across. What the vision must have been when they saw this jewel, this emerald jewel, sitting out there in the sea that they hadn't seen before. So I think that that's why it became it was like, let me go to where the gold is, or where that beautiful island is.
That's exactly right. And I can imagine their feeling once they had traversed the whole coastline over those decades and finally knew the whole island and where the riches were and where they wanted to sail. Now we're coming up to now. Brian was just approaching the 30-year mark in his age, and he was well prepared with battles, and his family had fallen in battles against the Vikings and against the Irish, I believe. But in around 974, the Norse of Limerick that Brian's brother had ejected, they rebelled, which surprise on that. But in 976, they killed him through treachery, really. He was captured by Donovan, and he was supposed to meet under a flag of truce at Brewery. And I think you're familiar with Brewery, aren't you, Peter?
Well, it's amazing when the same names show up. And I also wind up with theories in my head. But Brewery is the town in which Eamon de Valera grew up.
Yes.
Now, take all of this. We've mentioned with the Norsemen and the Irish that there was all of this interaction and marriage. So we have people who are Norse and Irish. Well, then they say, well, we have to get rid of the foreigner. Yet then, and remember our saying before that they became more Irish than the Irish, that old expression,
yes,
when they got to Ireland. Well, de Valera was a foreigner. His mother was Irish.
Right.
His father was a Spaniard who lived in Cuba. But de Valera was born in America.
And was one of the great patriots.
One of the great, you talk about the need of or the thought of a king of Ireland, and we call Charles Stewart Parnell the uncrowned king of Ireland. Well, de Valera had to be the other king of Ireland because he was in power for so many years in in the 20th century. But De Valera was but because his family was from Brury.
Wow,
and
that's right.
It's just interesting that has to be mentioned as a place where the Dalcassians were engaged.
Well, that's right, and that just shows for all the students of history how these things tie together and really start to make a lot more meaning to the student once he has studied them in all phases of Irish history. We've seen where now Brian Borus, his brother, is killed, and that leaves him next in line for the kingship through his tribe, and he becomes the king of Munster then, which is the southern province of Ireland and southwest, really. And he goes right away and attacks those who had killed his brothers. There were some Vikings, and then there was the king of Munster at that time. Before he assumed the throne was Malmud, and he went right after him. And you move right up to 980, and you're going to see the last old-style king of Tara. That would have been the Ui Neills, who tried to separate the island between themselves, north and south. And that was sort of the end of their reign around that time. And they continued to fight against the north and south sides of that tribe. And as they were fighting each other, Brian and his family, the Dalcassions, became more and more powerful. And they eventually were able to overthrow the last of the old-style kings. And they were called Ardri, but in actual fact, it looks like they were more over-kings, just temporary kings as long as their army held out. There was no formal succession as there might be in what you think of in modern days with a seat of power. And Brian's seat of power, of course, was in County Clare at all times.
We're talking about, you said, the Ardri. Who was it? Well, it was Malachy was the Ardri. But then Malachy and Brian came together in negotiation. But apparently it seems Brian always liked to negotiate. And I think that comes from that old notion of hospitality in Ireland, that if you come to my house, I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to share with you and we'll talk. And then Brian, as he grew older, came more interested in, let's sit down and talk so maybe we don't have to fight as much. And that's where he came into conflict with his son, who always wanted to go off and have a battle. And so Malachy, who was the present Ardri in these years, went to Brian. They joined their forces together to fight others, and they defeated them. And Malachy said to Brian, "You are the Ardri Boru," and that's how he then became the High King. Or, it's so difficult in those days to remember. They were tribal leaders, but it was Brian who then held the respect of all the other kings or the tribal chieftains. And, of course, it was said about, Boru, that Boru was the last man in Ireland who could match 100. Brian was the last who could match 100. He's the last man who killed 100 in one day. And that's what they were emphasizing, his superiority. And by him becoming the Ardri, it's saying that we all recognize you're pretty tough guy.
That's right. You've got the strongest army at the moment.
And we're not going to fight you. We'll negotiate, because if we don't, you'll kill us.
That's right.
So, and let's give him the whole thing. But then after Brian was killed, Malachy became the Ardri again.
That's right, and that's why many people say Malachy, and it's spelled a much longer way in some of the books there, but that's why they say Malachy might have been the superior strategist, because he survived.
He did, and I've also seen where it says that he was a nicer guy than Brian. He was honest and fair, and once he said it, he meant it.
Well, now we're starting to approach, we're around the 980s in our timeline here. We're trying to slowly approach it. And you can see with all this fighting going on, if you stop and think, the next great invasion of Ireland after the Vikings were the Normans, and all this internal fighting climaxing with Clontarf, you're going to see that really had weakened Ireland a tremendous amount when you think about what happened and how all the strength of Ireland was butchered on the battlefield at times. That really led to setting up for the Norman invasion and let them have Ireland at a much lighter cost, I think.
There was no one left to defend Ireland itself. I mean, and then the battles became between the Vikings who had been in Ireland, who had intermarried with the Irish, against the next Norman or the next Viking invaders.
Right, and there was constant. You just go back to 982. Brian was at war with the king of Tara and Ossory, and the king of the Norse of Dublin had fought and battled with him, and he invaded Dalcassion territory and cut down. Now, this is Malachi. He invaded Dalcassion territory in County Clare, and he cut down the sacred inauguration tree of Brian Borus and the Dalcassion clan at Mag Duine. And the following year, Brian struck back. It didn't stop him. It was a great insult to come into his territory and do that. And Malachi was saying, I'm still here. I haven't given up my kingship at that point. And the following year, Brian made 2 campaigns. He went with one. He took his fleet up the Shannon River, and with his allies, the Corcomoroo. And, of course, I'm sure you probably all heard of Corcomroe Abbey over there. Well, the ancient people that occupied that land were the Corcomoroo. And then he also captured Gilpatrick, the king of Ossory. So he's silencing more and more opposition, and he's growing every day. And Brian made a pact with the Norse of Waterford to attack the province of Leinster and Dublin, which is a pattern we see repeated over and over again. And the Norse he made the agreement with went by sea to attack the Ukinsella, and Brian went by land and burnt churches and fortresses, and he also went into Meath. So you see a continued battle of intimidation and war. And then right when they're out there fighting in all other directions, the Desai revolted against Brian in Munster, and he put that revolution down. And he took the fleet onto the Shannon, and he attacked the province of Connaught and Meath again from Lochrie. And we're moving up to 990 now, and you can see he's still attacking the province of Leinster, and he's still at war with the province of Connaught. And Malachi, the king of the northern Ui Neill, they are still fighting, and they marched down to Munster, and they burned Nina, and he actually defeated Brian in battle. And then Brian thought better, and he strengthened all of his defenses, and he took hostages from the province of Leinster. And so now he's consolidated his hold in the province of Munster and the whole of the south of Ireland. So it's time to make a deal. So Brian and King Malachi, the last king of the old ways, met near Clontarf, and they agreed to divide Ireland in half, the north and the south.
Interesting, because it isn't the North and the South we know as today, but it's still a division, which can bring our thoughts to what's happening even today. Why are the same problems repeating themselves over and over? And it becomes, of course, to economic control.
And now we're approaching the year 1000 in the timeline, and you see that Brian and the King Malachi the Great, after they met, they united for the first time against the Norse of Dublin. Now, this is a rare moment in Ireland because you've got the two high kings uniting for a cause, and that's to get the Norse. And that theme would play out for another decade. And the Norse of Dublin and Leinster united at that point to fight against Brian, and they met at Glenmama, which was a very famous battle, and they plundered Dublin and expelled Sitrick. And Sitrick, the Viking, he found no refuge anywhere, so he came back. And, so he wasn't expelled from Ireland. He just didn't have anywhere else to go. And Brian let him come back. But he had to give Brian hostages. And Brian then restored him. And I'm sure Brian took a few tributes as well to let Sitrick come back. And then after Brian took care of that, he marched on the great king Malachi More of the North. And then Malachi rode to meet him, and Brian looked and said, well, I think I'll go home now. So he avoided that battle because I think he was wise enough to see he might have been in trouble. But that didn't stop the battles. Brian then battles Maxenil, who built a barrier across the Shannon at Athlone, and Brian took Athlone and hostages at that point. So he's encroaching upon the northern territory of Ireland, the northern half, and that leaves just the Ui Neill, the traditional rulers of the north, as independent of Brian, and he's moving in on them.
When you talk about the taking of hostages, there's a couple of things that are there. We might even look and say, well, were they taking slaves, people who would do other work? But there's an interesting concept in some of the Irish hospitality notion. It's if they were children that they wound taking because the father was killed and they weren't going to be mass murderers, they would take the children and raise them. And there's a concept that we'll talk about at another time on an expanded sense, but fosterage, where they took people in and then they raised them what they thought to be properly, giving them the proper education, giving them the proper religion. And so even though Brian was plundering and pillaging, going from place to place, he was also sending money to build up the monasteries. He also paid money to go get great works to restore some of the things that had been stolen from Ireland. And he was bringing them back to Ireland. He was very interested in replenishing what had been taken away from Ireland in its old treasures, be it in writings and in artifacts.
Because around the year 1005, Brian took hostages of the northern kingships, and he gave 20 ounces of silver to the clergy of Armagh, which was a brilliant political move as well as a religious salute.
Well, of course, Armagh, which is the ecclesiastical capital of Ireland, it's where St. Patrick founded his diocese, his see, and to this day, it's the major see in Ireland, and it's the primate of Ireland from the Catholic Church's standpoint, is the Cardinal Archbishop in Armagh.
Well, and you see after he took those hostages, about 6 years after that, he marched north again first, and then he conquered Clan Connell, and that made a kingship of the entire country. He had conquered everybody who could give him trouble, so he did not form a monarchy as we think of it today, but he became a romanticized king by all the writers to come after. And let's take a look at what would you think his reasons for success to date were? He was a great strategist. We saw that he's retreated on several occasions. He wasn't bullheaded to where he'd fight if he thought he might be defeated. And the north and the southern tribes were fighting against each other all the time, and he sort of laid back many times and let them weaken themselves. And the north had removed really strong Viking settlements that would become cities. They didn't really have them up there. There were some settlements, but not the independent cities. So the north were really lacking some money and some wealth because of their success against the Vikings, which is a little counterintuitive at first thought, but I think that's the way it worked.
You know, when you think of why Brian withheld his fighting, and he did it because for a time there he was interested in having peace, and there was a time in his kingship that there was complete peace in Ireland. But part of it is that, remember that my enemy's enemy is my friend. And Brian was able, I think, at times to see that. And so he manipulated each group against each other. Thus, as they were destroying each other, he was rising in stature. And, of course, Boru was and yes, historically, it is somewhat difficult to ascertain what is and isn't real. I mean, we have dates, we have some names, we have places, we're aware of that stuff, of those kinds of things, yet there are other things that grew up in legend after the fact that may not have happened, but they glorified an occasion or an event after it was over.
Well, we look here, what else had Brian done to consolidate his control? The Norse, or the Vikings of Limerick and Cork and Waterford, at least in pledge, were his subject, and that left just one spot that was a holdout, and that was the Norse of Dublin, and that's, of course, where the final battle took place. And, of course, when his recognizing of the power of the church in Ireland with that donation to Armagh and salute similar to that, showed that he was pretty savvy with the power structure in Ireland.
And there was with some of the, especially the Archbishop of Armagh, he, at the time, saw himself as all kingship came from God. And that the Archbishop, because we didn't have cardinals, the Archbishop was the one who should crown the king. And, of course, when the agreement between Malachy and Brian to become the Adri, the Archbishop was a little annoyed. Wait a minute. I'm the one who should be taking care of this. I'm the Archbishop, and therefore the church's rule over others. I have the highest kingship. And so Brian was, in some sense, trying to placate the archbishop by sending him gifts. It was almost like, hey, if I send you this, maybe you'll be quiet and won't give me any more trouble. Now, when you talk about the last things, we haven't mentioned Brian's wife, who had also been the wife of others, and you mentioned Cedric. Cedric was her son when she was married to the Viking leader, Olaf, in Dublin, and her name is Gormouth, and she marries Brian. But how that happened? Brian is in negotiations, because he didn't want to battle with the Norsemen first, so he discovers with Cedric, and Cedric is a smaller man and not as powerful and doesn't have the armies and doesn't have the strength because some of it had been battled down, so to speak. So they come to an agreement. Well, what can you give me? Well, what can you give me in order to get this going? And so Brian and Cedric come to a decision. And Cedric asks Boru, well, don't you have a lovely daughter? The daughter by the name of Emma. Well, yes, I do, but I think that she may be in love with someone else. Oh, really? Well, I need a wife. And I understand she's a very beautiful wife. And as the negotiations went on, well, what would you give me? He says, well, I could give you Gormouth, his mother. We have a very strange thing that Boru and the Viking, they share. Cedric gives his mother to Boru, and Boru gives his daughter to Cedric. So what you have is father-in-law, brother-in-law, stepson, stepbrother, stepsister. It becomes, so much like the monarchies of today, isn't it? Where someone's related to somebody.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, that's one of the most surprising stories when you start researching this in Irish history. This Gormla is an amazing figure, and it's so seldom that a woman would rise to the level of being recorded in the Annals of Ireland and the Annals of the Vikings. They actually said she instigated the whole problem, but isn't that like a bunch of men to blame the whole thing on the woman?
Well, absolutely. You always have to blame somebody. But the thing is, she was no lily on the wall, She was a powerful, strong woman. And to her Viking husband, Olaf, she said, well, I'm going with you. You're not going anywhere, woman. You're sitting down. She was a strategist. She could see it. But she was always manipulating. And finally, Brian discovered her manipulation, and he threw her out. And then she was then with Cedric when they started with the battles of attacking Dublin before the final battle, watching that he realized what she had done. Yet, and she was Irish. She was not a Viking. She was Irish. And her brother was the king over in Limerick. So you have this intermarriage, my brother, my brother-in-law, who's related to who? Yet they say she was the most beautiful woman in Ireland.
So ends this chapter of Irish History from the Hedgerow. The entire series is available at www.irishroots.com. We have broadcast series on genealogy, song, local history, as well as original publications for every county in Ireland. The Hedge School in Ireland was totally reliant upon the local community to survive, just as we are here today in our modern-day Hedge School.